G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. A lot of what you think you believe about TikTok, about social media, about young people, about depression, about cancel culture, resilience, free-range kids, about old people, and about how early you should get to the airport before your flight is a consequence of the generation that you're born into. Do you feel like you're part of a generation? Have you always felt like the generational definitions don't quite fit you? Well, today's guest is the world's leading expert on generations, on the differences between boomers and the silent generation and Gen X and Gen Z and millennials, and she has all the data to back it up. She's been researching this stuff for 25 plus years, and we get into all of that and more. She will be appearing at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney in August, where I will also be appearing on stage at one of their flagship events. It'll be me and Coleman Hughes. I hope you know and love Coleman as much as I do. He's an incredible thinker. His latest book is The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. If you Google Festival of Dangerous Ideas, Coleman, Zeps, Coleman Hughes, Josh, something like that, you will get to the ticketing page. If you're in Sydney, absolutely buy a ticket right now. Please don't miss it. We will also be doing a Melbourne event. So if you're in Melbourne, you don't have to fly to Sydney for it. The event in Sydney is on August 25th at Carriageworks as part of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. The one in Melbourne will be independent. We are doing this ourselves. We are funding it ourselves. Your assistance in proving to us that these things are viable would be greatly appreciated. The best way to get a pre-release sale, which will be going on sale within the next week or so, is to subscribe to Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack. You don't have to pay for it, but please go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com, sign up for a free subscription. You'll be alerted 24 hours before anybody else has the ability to buy tickets. That'll be on Wednesday, August 28th at the Athenaeum Theatre in Melbourne. Coleman Hughes, Josh Seps, Uncomfortable Conversations live. Please go and buy your ticket now. Without further ado, Dr. Jean Twenge is a psychologist, author, consultant, public speaker. She specializes, as I said, in generational differences about work values and life goals and social attitudes and, importantly, mental health. She's a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. She's written a book called iGen, Generation Me, The Narcissism Epidemic. She's been covered in Time Magazine and Newsweek and the New York Times and the Washington Post. Her latest book is called Generations, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silents, that is the silent generation, and what they mean for America's future. Go and buy tickets to Coleman Hughes and me. That's Festival of Dangerous Ideas, Carriageworks on August 25th in Sydney, the Athenaeum Theatre on the 28th of August in Melbourne. You can't buy tickets there yet, but you can get a heads up about the pre-release by subscribing for free to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com. Please enjoy as much as I did this chat with the one and only Jean Twenge. Wherever we want to. What exactly is a generation? Because I was playing a game with my 6-year-old daughter last night over dinner, and we sometimes do a "What person am I thinking of?" game, and you have to ask yes/no questions. And I asked her, "What generation is the person you're thinking of?" And in one particular family, it's usually pretty easy because there's like Nana and Pop's generation, and then there's Daddy's generation, and then there's her generation. But I'm married to a guy who's 9 years younger than me, who is the eldest in his family, and I'm the baby in my family. And my parents had kids late in their 30s, and his parents had kids early in their 20s. So his mum is only 10 years older than my eldest brother, and like 20 years younger than my eldest parent. And so my daughter was like, well, hang on, what generation exactly is it? Like, people keep having babies every year, right? It's not like we reach a 20-year point and then everyone's like, okay, let's start a new generation again. So why is there a generation from 1965 to 1980, but not 1975 to 1990?
Yeah. So you're right. You know, the classic definition of generations is within one family that you have the kids and the parents and the grandparents and the great-grandparents. But when we use the word generations these days, we usually mean social or cultural generations. And that's what I study and have looked at. And you're right that those birth year cutoffs are fairly arbitrary. In some cases, there's good reasons for them. In others, well, 15 or 20 years has passed, and that seems like maybe it's the right time, and it's just kind of where we're going to draw the line. Um, Same thing with the labels. There's not a commission that decides what each generation is going to be called. It's just kind of what the media settles on.
And is it defined by a communal shared experience that generation has, or a changing arc of technology that they experience, or some combination of both?
So the traditional theory of generations is about big events. So wars, economic recessions and depressions, pandemics, things like that. The idea is that if you experience a certain event at a certain point in your life, that's why generations differ from each other. But that really falls short for explaining a lot of the generational differences that show up. It also doesn't explain why it's so different to live now compared to 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. The answer to that question is technology. That's why it's different to live now. And that's why in my book...
that's why it's different to live in 2024, but it may not be the main thing that was different about living in 2020.
Well, that's true. So those shorter periods of time, especially when you have an enormous event like the COVID-19 pandemic, is going to shift things a little bit. That is true. I'm not saying the major events have no impact, just that their impact in terms of big cultural changes and big generational changes tends to be smaller and more limited, and not as day-to-day in the long run as the effects of technology.
And I suppose that
COVID was huge too. Yeah. Arguably it was the biggest event since World War II.
And I suppose that the way that those big events manifest themselves and the ripple effects that they can have culturally is then mediated by the technology that we're all living inside of, in the sense that, if COVID-19 happens without social media, maybe you don't get the racial reckoning of 2020 when George Floyd is killed. Maybe you don't get, this or that. So
well, you wouldn't have gotten a vaccine if it wasn't for medical technology. That's true. Another example.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, the peaks of it probably would have been bigger and longer. Who knows if we would have had the lockdowns and those, mitigation measures if it wasn't for scientific studies. So yeah, there's definitely things that intersect. The other piece of it on the more negative side for technology is it's also why it spreads so fast around the world because of air travel. Airplanes.
Yeah. Would and in terms of, you mentioned lockdowns, in terms of compliance with state authority, I'm intrigued by the way that different cultures were able to do that. I'm particularly intrigued because I come from one of the few Western liberal democracies that seemed to have a more East Asian attitude towards authority, a greater obedience, greater adherence to rules, greater tolerance of strict lockdowns than other, certainly English-speaking countries did. Do you think that technology and generations affect our relationship to collectivism, communalism, authority?
Yeah, definitely. So, in the book, I wrote about two, I call them daughters of technology, and individualism is one of those. So that's often understood as the opposite of collectivism. Basically, individualism is more focused on the self, less on social rules. So here in the US, individualism, I think, is the most concise explanation for the people who did not want to follow vaccine mandates or mask mandates or lockdowns. There's lots of arguments for why people didn't want to follow those, but one of the most fundamental was you can't tell me what to do. That's at base where most of the arguments were, and that's individualism in a nutshell. And that differs across cultures and countries, but it also has differed over time. If that pandemic had happened in 1955 in the US, I think you would have seen a lot more compliance with those types of government mandates. There was more trust in government. There was a more communal feeling. There was much more of a respect for the idea that we need to all follow certain rules.
And is the erosion of that trust and the erosion of those norms, what do you put it down to? Many people point the finger at forms of technology, which would be consistent, I think, overall with your thesis, that social media is playing some kind of a role here. Are there other factors?
There's lots of factors. I do think a lot of it does come back to technological progress, that allows people to be more independent and not have to work together as much. But there's certainly many factors you look at. Regional differences, as you pointed out, they're considerable in individualism and collectivism. So there are many factors. I think going over time and seeing how individualism has increased over time, I think technology is one of the key factors.
And individualism versus collectivism, this tension shows up, at least I first noticed it in your work when you first came across my radar when you wrote your book about millennials, Generation Me, and your thesis was basically that what marks this generation out, correct me if I'm wrong, is a sense of individualism, a sense about the importance of the individual. I'm special. It's all about me. In the time since, it seems like a great deal of the worries that older people have about young people these days is that they're actually quite identitarian and quite tribal and quite group focused, that they're very focused on, I suppose, redressing historical harms that have been done to marginalized communities, identifying with particular sub-communities. Do you map that? What do you make of that change, or am I getting that change wrong?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's tough because there's not a whole lot of evidence suggesting, for example, that Gen Z is more collectivistic. I don't think I've ever seen anything necessarily showing that, but I know where you're coming from in that, they are a little more politically active than millennials were at the same age. For example, they are putting a lot of focus on helping others, on correcting inequalities. However, that's individualism too. It's just a different flavor. So one of the core things around individualism is to treat people as equal, regardless of their race or gender or sexual orientation, or gender identity. So that's where a lot of that comes from. And Gen Z has taken that and said, okay, so silence and boomers worked on the race part and the gender part to an extent. So did Gen X. Millennials tackled sexual orientation, and then they're tackling gender identity, gender fluidity, being transgender, being non-binary, in a way that a lot of older generations are like, wait, I don't even know these words that you're using. It's a huge generation gap. And I think that's just kind of like almost in some ways the next step if you're going to look at equality movements and where individualism takes you. I think that's at base where it comes from with Gen Z.
Just because you mentioned the silence with a TS, not a CE, and Gen X and the boomers, let's do a quick definitional thing here. Maybe you just start with the greatest generation before the silent generation and just roll through the generations as you see them and what time period they cover.
Sure. So the greatest generation is those born roughly 1901 to 1924. So they are the generation who fought and won World War II, whether that was on the front lines or on the home front. So that was their distinguishing experience, and they tended to have a civic orientation, a more collective orientation their whole lives. The silent generation, born 1925 to 1945, starts to begin some of the changes that we now associate with our modern world, like the civil rights movement in the US, the feminist movement. Those are associated with boomers. It's really not true. If you look at the leaders of those movements, they were silent. So as just two examples, Martin Luther King Jr., Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both silent generation. So it's really a misnomer that they're called the silent generation. They got that label because they did marry young. They did, live rather conventional lives in some ways, but they started this change that the boomers started, that the boomers continued. So the boomers, named after the demographic fact, just a lot of babies being born after World War II and the decade after, born 1946 to 1964. And when I think about them in relation to silence, I think the silence changed the laws when it came to, say, race and gender and to some extent sexual orientation and equality. The boomers changed hearts and minds. They lived those changes in a way that the silence often didn't get.
What's the causal directionality there, Jean? Because I would have assumed that maybe the silent generation was somewhat dragged kicking and screaming into changing the laws because the kids, the boomers, were making such a ruckus about it. Or have I got that backwards?
Well, you think about the civil rights movement, that predated the boomers turning 18. The first boomers turned 18 in what, 1964?
Right, 4, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of that was well on its way before that.
So
And
none of them
then
even
with the
voted for JFK. There was no boomer who voted for JFK. That does my head in. Yeah, okay, that's cool.
Well, especially because back then the voting age was 21.
Ha!
It didn't change to 18 until the early 1970s.
Right, and Kennedy died in 63. They turned 18 in 64. Now, are you doing a little bit of sort of cheeky math when you're talking about MLK being technically a silent generation person? Because my mum was born in 45, and I firmly put her as a boomer. I know that technically
MLK was born in the 1930s. I can't tell you the exact date, but in the 1930s.
Okay.
So was Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Got it. All right. So even if there's some fuzziness at the edges, and we're thinking of my mum as being a boomer,
solidly
from 45, he's a silent generation. Okay, great. So silent generation actually does the things that we usually give boomers credit for, the civil rights movement, the revolution of the 1960s. At that time, though, presumably in the mid-60s and late 60s, those boomers are now coming of age. They're in their late teens, they're in their early 20s, and they're vaulting this revolution into hypergear, essentially. Would that be fair?
I think so. Although, they were more the participants and the silent generation were more the leaders. So the feminist movement is a great example. Here in the US, kind of the peak, at least the peak of the media attention around it was about 1970. And so there were lots of boomer participants, but the people who were leading that movement were either greatest generation or silence.
So Germaine Greer, Camille Paglia, these people are silent generation. Yeah,
I don't know about Camille Paglia, but Germaine Greer
would be early 40s, I
Gloria
guess.
Steinem,
yeah,
their silence. Betty Friedan, greatest generation.
Yep. Okay. And so, where do you place like Woodstock? What is that doing?
So that's a boomer event, and I would associate that a little more with boomers. Although Jimi Hendrix also, at least technically by the definition, silent. Bob Dylan, silent. Joan Baez, silent.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, they're 1940s, so they're it's true.
Man, people already hate on the boomers for being the lucky ones. Not only are they the lucky ones, they didn't even do the things that they claim to have done.
I don't think they're necessarily the lucky ones. We can get to that later.
Okay, great. We'll get to that. So moving on from the boomers, we then get to the forgotten generation, Generation X.
That's right. So that's my generation. We are the middle child of generations. Literally, in a way, because we have those two generations of adults who are older than us and two who are younger than us. We're also the middle child because we get forgotten all the time. But we like it that way. We like to fly under the radar. It works. Gen Xers take pride in being tough, in being the last generation with solidly raised in the pre-internet age. Yet, familiar enough with technology that they founded a lot of the tech companies. So Google and Yahoo, as two examples, were founded by Gen Xers.
Right. And you make the point that there's actually never been a Gen X president of the United States because you went straight from the silent generation in Reagan and George H.W. Bush.
He was greatest.
Reagan was greatest. George H.W. is silent, I assume. And then you go...
technically greatest, he's right on the edge, 1924.
Okay, great. Yep, I see. And then you jump straight to boomers, and then from the boomers, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and George W. Bush, you jump back to
Trump.
And Trump. You jump back to the silent generation and Joe Biden. Now, if Joe Biden resigns, you might get your Gavin Newsom, who I assume is Gen X.
He's a Gen Xer.
Yeah, right.
1967.
Okay, but if not, you might just trail straight on to what would it be after? What? Okay, let's keep going because now I'm blanking. What's after Gen X? A millennial.
Yeah, and I realized I didn't say the year for Gen X. So Gen X, there's various definitions. I use 1965 to 1979. Then millennials, 1980 to 1994.
Okay.
So they are often the children of boomers. They are known for self-confidence and optimism growing up in the 1990s when there was a lot of child focus because the boomers were raising their kids and kind of where the boomers, such a large generation where the culture was often dictated by them. So millennials had that protected childhood. And they were really the first to experience childhood and adolescence in the age of the internet. Instant messaging is something they still talk about a lot. And all of those experiences. Social media, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, who founded Facebook, now Meta, is probably the most famous millennial.
Right. And kids, and also, I mean, it was a time of extreme sort of casual opulence, I suppose, at least in hindsight, where in the 80s and 90s, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, and it's morning in America, and everything's swell, and Bill Clinton's playing the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show.
Absolutely.
And, Seinfeld is a show
funny,
about nothing and all that.
I don't think that when we were living in the 90s, at least my experience of living in the 90s wasn't that we didn't think, oh, this is going to be the best time ever. But in some ways, it really was.
I mean, I thought it was because I was in school and it was great and there was nothing to worry about. And then when I started actually paying attention to things, 9/11 happened and everything seemed a lot more complicated. So after the millennials, you get Gen Z.
Gen Z or Gen Z.
Gen Z, yep.
Yep. So that's, I define them as born 1995 to 2012. And what really distinguishes them from the millennials is Gen Z is the first generation to spend their entire adolescence in the age of the smartphone and ubiquitous social media. So millennials played around with social media, but it wasn't really mandatory in the way that it has become for Gen Z. And millennials tended not to get a smartphone in middle school or early high school. It was late high school at the earliest. So I realized there was this generational break when in the big surveys that I work with, suddenly things started to change in the data on teenagers around 2012. So that maps onto the mid 90s as a turning point for generations, because I'd gotten used to seeing changes that were big, but they take a decade or two to get there. There wasn't like a clear cutoff, say, between Gen X and millennials, but between millennials and Gen Z, there was a very, very clear difference that happened around those birth years in terms of lots of stuff,
Right.
but most prominently mental health and happiness.
And what about Gen Z and the subsequent generation?
Well, so you mean the generation after Gen Z?
Yeah.
So many people call them alphas. I call them polars after melting polar ice caps and political polarization. I think I'm going to strike out on this one. I don't think polars is going to stick. I would love it if it did, because I really hate the letters. I think they're just boring and derivative. And especially alpha is like, oh, Z, that's the last letter of the alphabet. What are we going to do now? I guess we got to start over at the beginning.
It reminds me of when we were all learning about Greek numbers during COVID, and we're like, what comes after Omicron? What is it?
I know.
Epsilon, Delta? Where are we?
Know, right?
Yeah.
I know.
Okay, so and the polar. I'm going to call them polars here. You're my guest.
Why not?
Why not? Let's call them polars. They start when?
So they start with those born about 2013. And we don't know yet when they're going to end. I made a wild guess 2029, but we will see. What I think is really, there's a couple things that are very interesting about that generation. One is partially because of fairly young children already being on TikTok and social media platforms, there's already a hate war between Gen Z and polars on TikTok. Apparently, and I found this out from my own Gen Z children, Gen Z calls the next youngest generation, alphas or polars, they call them crusty iPad kids, because they are the first generation to never know a world without the iPad.
Mm.
The iPad was introduced in 2010, and apparently they don't wash their hands before they use it, which is how crusty. This is
I love it. I love it. Gen
but I
Z
think it's absolutely
judgmental.
fascinating that, we have 11-year-olds having generational debates, apparently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the most popular people who my kids like to watch on YouTube when I let them are children who are their age or just older.
Yeah.
They're polars. They're 8-year-olds who have 100 million followers on YouTube, and they make videos about themselves going to amusement parks. You mentioned that the boomers may not have been as lucky as we think they are, and so I just want to touch on boomers and millennials for a bit, because this is a big, this is a big cultural rift. There are a lot of comics in their late 30s and early 40s who are millennials, whose whole shtick is about how they were screwed by the boomers. The boomers managed to buy a house for the price of an old shoe.
Climbed the ladder, and then after they got up, pulled it up so the millennials couldn't
and then the drawbridge, and now the millennials have absolutely nothing, and the boomers are just clinging onto their multi-million-dollar properties that they bought from, whatever they could trade in at the thrift store. Is it true?
No, it's just not. Now, there's a little subtlety to that answer, but let me tell you why I just out and out say no. And I'm going to acknowledge some of this is going to vary depending on what country we're talking about. I'm mostly focusing on the US because that's where I know the data best and the culture the best. So if you look at US Census data on median incomes, whether that's household or family or personal, doesn't matter, they are at all-time highs for millennial-aged adults. They are making more money adjusted for inflation than boomers were at the same age. So when I've written about this, even when I say adjusted for inflation in all caps, somebody on Twitter has to say, now show me adjusted for inflation. Because nobody believes it.
Right.
Nobody believes it. But this is US Census data. It's not like this is some survey that I did through some company, that got 1,000 people. This is the official data that we've got. It's very solid.
Okay, but can I push back yet, or do you want to finish that thought?
Year after year, that's what it shows. What's that?
Can I push back yet, or do you want to finish that thought?
I'll say a few more things, and then you're welcome to push back. Absolutely. So median incomes, very high. Homeownership rates are actually only a couple of percentage points lower for millennials at the same age compared to you Gen Xers and boomers. Now, I'm the first to acknowledge last couple of years have been tough. But if you look at especially the first wave of millennials born in the 80s, most of them were buying their first houses in the 2010s. Well, that was the exact same time everybody's like, millennials will never be able to buy a house. So God, we got totally screwed. If you look at housing affordability, it was very high during that time in the US because housing prices had crashed after the housing bubble burst during the Great Recession, and mortgage rates were very low. So they got the best of both worlds. So the millennials born in the 80s who bought during that time are sitting pretty. Those who didn't, not so much. Those born in the 90s, not so much. But a big 2/3 chunk of the millennials did pretty well in the housing market. Because what people forget is that when boomers were buying their houses in the 80s, mortgage rates were 17%. So housing affordability was actually pretty bad.
Right, but 17% of a nickel and a halfpenny is still not a lot.
It's not that extreme. If you look at the actual mortgage payments, it's not that extreme. Now, absolutely what has changed is the down payment. So millennials had to come up with a bigger down payment than boomers did. That's absolutely true. Even adjusted for inflation, absolutely true. But a lot of their boomer parents helped them with that.
Yeah.
For one thing.
Yeah.
And if you look at the month-to-month cost, it's virtually identical.
Interesting. Okay, so I think the home situation may be different in the US than it is in Australia. We didn't have a big property crash during the Great Recession. So there was a minor correction after COVID, and there was a minor correction then. But Australia didn't even slip into recession during the Great Recession. I think not for more than 1 or 2 quarters. And also in Australia, home loans are variable over the course of the. So you don't get to take advantage of the low interest rates for very long. You might get a fixed rate for 3 years, 4 years if you're lucky, 5 years at the absolute most. But then you've still got the remainder of a 30-year loan, and it floats around. The US is a bit of an outlier in having a fixed rate, very, very, very long fixed rate mortgages. I think that's because of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which I don't even know what they are or understand. But hey, there you go. There you go. In terms of the incomes being comparable, even adjusted for inflation, isn't there something to be said for the expectation that you're going to be able to live a life of dignity and relative opulence compared to your peers and compared to what you see reflected in the media around you, such that what would have been a decent income 30 or 40 years ago will only provide you with the living standards of 30 or 40 years ago today, which is just not going to cut it. I mean, your expectation today is that if you don't have 2 television sets and you don't have devices and you don't have the iPads and so on, then you're falling behind. So very little of our sense of well-being comes in absolute terms, right? I mean, there's an old line about how you're rich if you make more than your brother-in-law.
Exactly.
So is that so in other words, millennials have some right to feel like they're hard done by, because they might technically be earning as much as the boomers were at their age, but that doesn't get them as high on the totem pole as they'd need to be to feel the same.
So, and I think feel is the key word there, because it gets them higher, objectively
Well, it gets
speaking.
them higher on an objective totem pole of, like, you start with the caveman and then you go with the trajectory of, like, the caveman gradually evolves into modern man. But if you take a snapshot of 2024, they're not as high up that totem pole as their parents were in 1985.
I'm not sure I get the logic, but I mean, I think some of it is that one thing that people forget is that, yes, the price of some things like childcare and education and housing have outpaced inflation, but other things are cheaper than they used to be when corrected for inflation. Televisions are a great example. Any kind of computer or smartphone or electronic device is much cheaper than it used to be. So the whole thing about having two televisions, well, yeah, it's much easier to do that because televisions are so much cheaper now.
Right.
than they used to be.
Yep.
But I do think the expectations piece does play in there, especially given the millennial childhood of extremely high expectations, lots of optimism. How could those expectations possibly have been fulfilled because they're so high? That comes partially from individualism and partially from parenting. But it's also, again, coming back to technology. Think about someone in 1955, say a boomer kid at that age, at that year. And when they looked around them, maybe they would see things on TV, but that was usually fairly solidly middle-class people. Mostly they're going to be looking around their town, and they might see like the one or two, truly well-off rich people in their town. Now, rich people are everywhere on reality TV, on social media, everywhere. And it's very, very easy to consume that content and get the idea that you're really poor, even if you're not.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, just to tease out the point that I was trying to make, if you parachute someone from today on an average income into the 1950s, they're fabulously wealthy. That doesn't mean that they're going to feel fabulously wealthy on a daily basis today. And you can make the reverse thought experiment. You can take a wealthy person from the 50s and put them today, and they won't believe how wealthy even the working poor seem today in terms of their creature comforts.
Right.
But it's non-comparable.
And that is the other thing we have to keep in mind, that poverty rates are way down. That's the other thing that's not acknowledged often in this conversation, is the number of people who are truly poor is much, much less than it was, say, in the 1950s, at least in the US. It's gone way, way, way down. But in terms of how you feel today, when we're talking about a median income, that means the 50% mark. And so that number is higher for millennials than it was for Gen Xers and boomers at the same age. Not by a ton, but people think it's lower and it's actually higher.
And people seem to think that there are more poor people as well, and that poverty is getting worse.
There's not.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you that, yes, on the data, there's not. Certainly in absolute terms, but let me come back to the relative term again. As inequality grows and as our ability to spy on people at the very top grows, you can certainly have a sensation of being left behind, which translates as I am poor, or there are lots of poor people around, even if those poor people, are technically 50% richer than the poor people of 15 years ago.
And that may be true. A lot of it is, I think, in that perception piece for sure.
So why has that perception changed?
I think social media, reality TV, a lot of those things have a lot to do with it. And just individualism as well. That at base, that kind of builds up the idea of the self as being very important. It's related. It tends to correlate with materialism. tends to correlate with high expectations. And those are all things that would make someone who, say, has a median income feel like they weren't actually doing that well.
Right. I mean, I can hear economically leftist listeners listening to this and thinking, yeah, but we're eliding the inability of modern liberal democracies to share the wealth as well as they should have. And we're pretending that there's no there because everybody is supposed to be a perfectly rational calculating machine about their own well-being in comparison to some imaginary person who they never met in their grandparents' generation. But the reality is, we're very productive societies. We're not doing a very good job of sharing it around. We're not doing a very good job of addressing the economic concerns of people who then go on to vote for the far right in France or for Donald Trump in the United States, and who find cultural excuses to release their anxiety and their sense of frustration about the fact that the system is rigged against them.
Right. Yeah. And that's a very, very Gen Z thing, is to say the system is rigged. And I think, again, we have to take a little bit of a step back that, yes, income inequality is way too high. However, the biggest increase in income inequality happened between 1980 and 2000. That was a long time ago. It has not, it has continued to inch up, but not even close to the pace that it increased in the 1980s and 1990s. And were millennials depressed and saying that the system was rigged when they were in high school, when income inequality was actually increasing faster? They were not. Gen Z says that, even though they're not witnessing as much change in that area. And they will say that very young, that the system is rigged and those types of ideas. And I think that is rooted in that really pronounced generational break between millennials and Gen Z, from optimism to pessimism.
Has Gen Z persuaded millennials of this point? Because now millennials seem to agree. And in fact, many Gen Xers agree. Right. Whether you're watching Russell Brand or, Joe Rogan or whoever it might be, there is a relentless shtick at the moment that the system is stitched up against us all.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right. It may not be Gen Z necessarily convincing millennials, but millennials growing up being disappointed and thinking I didn't get what I expected to get. And then just the general push toward negativity that seems to be pervasive in the culture and has been for about 10 or 15 years, has started to move up the age scale to millennials.
So iGen, the subtitle of your book, of your second to last book, is Why Today's Superconnected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. It's 7 years since that was published, therefore it's presumably a decade since you started thinking about writing it. Has anything changed since then?
In almost all cases, the graphs in that book, the line just kept going in the same direction, whether it was up or down. So in Generations, when I worked on the Gen Z chapter, I grabbed a lot of those graphs and just updated them, and they kept going. So, Gen Z teenagers now, compared to 7 years ago, are even less likely to have a driver's license or have a paid job or drink alcohol. They are even more likely to be depressed or to be admitted to the emergency room for self-harm. Almost all of the big trends have just kept going in the same direction.
So I recently spoke to the head of pediatric mental health at one of the big hospitals in Australia about what's going on with the young people. I'm sure it's the same in the States, but something like 1 in 5 boys between the age of 8 and 12, has a diagnosable mental condition. Then there are all the statistics that you cite about self-harm among adolescent girls. Jonathan Haidt's been banging on about this. And this mental health pediatrician was basically saying, look, life is really tough for people. I see families who are sleeping in tents in campgrounds because they can't afford a home, because the cost of living crisis is getting out of control, because rents are very high, because, he's attributing this to economic factors. You would presumably have a different explanation about what's going on with youth mental health. What would yours be?
Well, at least in the US, the economic explanation doesn't fit the data at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite, that we had the Great Recession. That did have a big effect on people. There were a lot of foreclosures. The unemployment rate went way up. And all of that happened around 2007, 2008, 2009. Unemployment peaked in 2010. Then by 2012, things were finally starting to improve. And between 2012 and when COVID hit, unemployment went way down. Just everything. Poverty rate went down. The number of children in poverty went down. Every economic indicator that you can point to improved between 2011 and 2019. That's exactly when teen depression doubled in the US.
And that's true here as well. I mean, the Australian economy is good.
Economics could explain that.
Yeah. We have solid growth, not quite as strong as America's. Our stock market's good, not quite as strong as America's. But on the counterpoint, we have less inequality. We have higher median incomes. We have, lower poverty rates. And so, so there's something going on about the interpretation, right? This is coming back to absolute data, the sort of binary that we were talking about before with absolute data versus the feeling of how we're doing. So let's talk about social media and devices and reality TV and wherever else you want to go. What is shaping our feelings about how we're doing, and how is that translating into the mental condition of kids?
Yeah. So what we have to ask, given that 2012 is such a turning point in the data in the US and Australia and the UK and in countries around the world for mental health, that's around when loneliness goes up, depression goes up, self-harm goes up. In some countries, in some groups, suicide goes up. We see that as a huge turning point, that early 2010s period. So what happened? So it wasn't the economy. A lot of other explanations that have been offered are US specific, like school shootings or the opioid epidemic, or those are things that haven't affected the UK and Australia as much, for example. So that doesn't fit. I have a Substack called Generation Tech, and I went through 13 alternative explanations for why depression might have gone up. None of them fit. What does fit is end of 2012. That is the first time that the majority of Americans owned a smartphone, pretty similar in the UK and Australia. Social media was at a turning point around that time as well, because say 2009, only about half of teens in the US use social media every day. Then it became more and more popular to use it every day. It became almost mandatory. Facebook bought Instagram around that time. The algorithms started to become much more sophisticated on social media, keep people on the platforms for longer. The iPhone that was introduced around that time was the first with the front-facing camera. So they start taking more selfies. We had much more image-based, much more mandatory social media that was used much more often, and the ubiquity of the smartphone right around that time too. So for teens, it's not just the growth of these technologies. It's also around the same time that the decline in them spending time with their friends in person began to rapidly accelerate. They also started to spend less time sleeping. So you put this together, and I don't think this is the whole explanation, but it's a good chunk of it. Teens are spending less time sleeping, less time with their mates in person, and more time alone looking at a small rectangle. That doesn't sound like a very good formula for mental health. And sure enough, it's not. And then you get into all of the content and cyberbullying and body image issues and everything on social media. There's so many different mechanisms. That's why they get such a compelling explanation. Not just that it happened at the same time. That's not enough.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Do we have any causal, obviously, this is the old conundrum of statistics about noticing correlations versus causations. Is there any causal data here, or is this a hunch?
So, correlations are much more than a hunch first. People often misinterpret the idea that correlation is not causation to mean correlation is never causation, and that's not the case. It just means that A causing B is only one of the possibilities. So I think there's a couple answers to this. So first, we can take the group level and the individual level. Take the group level that we're talking about, that rise in depression over time. Well, if we're going to say reverse causation, that it's kids who are depressed and then they spend more time on devices, you'd have to say, okay, teen depression doubled for some completely unknown reason around the world that nobody's been able to figure out yet. And that's why they bought smartphones. That's why they started spending more time on social media. It really doesn't fit that reverse causation argument. And then the third factors that are often used to explain the correlation don't fit either, because you're looking at the average. Okay, so then on the individual level, that's a whole other set of data that, for example, the more hours a day a teen spends on social media, the more likely it is he or she will be depressed. Often the difference between the non-users and the heavy users, twice as many of the heavy users are depressed compared to the light ones. So it's not a small link, but correlational. So how can we do experiments? You really can't randomly assign teenagers to spend 8 hours a day on social media versus not. Questionable in its ethics and feasibility. So what people have done instead is kind of the opposite idea. They've asked usually young adults, often university age, to cut back or give up social media for a certain period of time compared to those who just continue their normal use. Then they measure happiness and loneliness and depression. And the majority of those studies, especially those that follow people for 2 weeks or more, have found that cutting back or giving up social media has meant at the end of that time more happiness and less depression.
Fascinating. And is there a collective action problem on addressing this? I mean, the sense that I get is that not just that I get, I know that there's data on this in terms of opinion polls. When you poll people in their late teens and early 20s, that if you ask them, how much they value their own presence on social media, they value it very, very highly. But when you give them the option of the thought experiment of nobody being on social media, they vastly prefer that to the option of either them being on it or off it, which raises then like a public policy question and a public health question rather than an individual restraint question.
Exactly. And that's what we have to acknowledge. And that's, I think, why so many teens are struggling and so many parents are struggling to help their kids, because there's the idea of like, okay, we can put these restrictions on, but then there's the fear of missing out. There's mom, everybody else is doing it. There's what am I going to miss if I'm not on social media? And it's also the other collective action problem is if a teen wants to act like it's 1985, and there is no social media and there are no smartphones, who are they going to go out with when all of their mates are on social media alone in their bedrooms?
Also, even if their mates are going out, then they're not going to know about where they're going out because they're not going to get the message about going out. No one's going to text them individually to tell them where the party is. That's all being organized on WhatsApp group.
On the phone.
They don't.
I know.
They won't.
I know they don't. But radical idea.
It's crazy, Jean. You're such a Gen X, You're picking up the telephone.
Totally.
Do you pick up the telephone and call people, or do you text?
Both. I do both.
Right. You don't have this kind of pathological fear, which I may just be young enough to have of like calling. I mean, I'm calling people unless someone's mother has died. I'm not calling you. Then we have to do a stupid chit chat thing where we pretend to ask each other how the day was and what we're up to and this and that.
Well, social psychology suggests that you should be doing that. It's actually good for your mental health. When people do that, they report feeling happier and more connected to other people, even the same people who dreaded doing that to begin with, whether that's calling somebody or having a conversation with someone on a train. Those are pretty cool studies.
Do you call the takeaway joint, or do you order it on an app?
Well, I tend to have my husband tends to do that. He likes driving. I don't. I mean, I'll do it, but he actually really likes getting in the car, so he'll usually do that.
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing debate between my friends and I about people, who just have the idea of calling, a Chinese restaurant to place my order for them to deliver it. It seems like such a tremendous waste of time when I could do it on an app. But some people kind of like that, you're talking to another person.
And sometimes the app will take longer.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Then you feel like I think it is easier for somebody to get the order wrong. Verbally.
Yes, but that's part of the messy reality of life, Jean. That's part of living with other human beings on this crazy planet.
True. That is true.
I feel like the things that you were talking about in iGen have suddenly made a resurgence in 2024, largely as a result of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and we're all now wringing our hands about this. How do you feel? I mean, you're probably partly gratified by this, but is there any sense of you that goes, dude, I was writing about this, I published this 7 years ago, man?
Yeah, I have had that thought, admittedly. Yes. But this is the natural evolution of things, is when you're first. And I don't know, I don't want to claim too strongly that I was first. There's certainly were many people before me talking about the dangers of too much screen time but still, the idea that this rise in depression among teens might be linked to smartphones and social media, I was kind of first.
Yeah.
And when you're first, people always think you're wrong. And then the natural evolution is slowly as time goes by, and I'm biased here, but if you're relying on solid data from teens themselves, going straight to the source, you're not asking their parents or, managers what they think of young employees, you actually got data from teens and young adults. There's a pretty good chance you're going to be right.
Yeah, right. And can you just tease apart when we talk about screen time? I think that often I speak to people about this and they say, oh, this is just the natural evolution. People were worried about newspapers. They were worried about television. They were worried about radio. Of course, we're worried about the new technology. There's nothing wrong with my child playing some educational video games on the iPad. And I say, no. We're not talking about educational video games on the iPad. We're talking specifically about algorithmic social media, at least in my world. How do you divide up the different things that we might be doing online?
Yeah. So the tough part is the data that we've got is only okay on that question. It's not great because the studies that have been able to really dig into what exactly are people doing, like more like content, like really atomized, not just that they're on the iPad, not just that they're on social media, but like they're watching cat videos as opposed to videos about being depressed, tend to be small sample size if they exist at all. So the big data sets, the nationally representative data sets that we've got are more of a blunt instrument. They're asking, how much time do you spend on social media? How much time do you spend watching videos? How much time do you spend gaming? How much time do you spend online? And in a lot of data sets, when you do that, particularly like one in the UK, the links between depression and screen time are much stronger for social media and general internet use than for gaming and TV.
Right.
It doesn't show up in every data set, though. And I think that has to do with the fact that the lines have blurred, especially in recent years, because is TikTok, is that social media or watching videos? It could be either one. It is algorithmic. So I think that's a difficulty. And then we also don't know about the content that people are watching. Are they watching educational videos on YouTube, or are they watching misinformation and going down a negative wormhole of content?
What's your suspicion, Jean, about the salience of social media versus the salience of algorithms? Because my gut tells me that algorithms, I mean, I would put TikTok as problematic because I think there's something pernicious about 22-year-old software engineers in Silicon Valley designing the most addictive and efficacious, well, in TikTok's case, it's not Silicon Valley, it's in the hallways of the Chinese Communist Party, but wherever it is, trying to create a catnip that inexorably distracts your attention and holds your gaze for as long as it can. But what's your instinct?
I think the algorithms are definitely a big part of the problem. I wouldn't say they were the only problem, but they are a big part of the problem because then there's two big problems with the algorithms, probably more, but two come to mind. One is that they keep people on the app for longer and keep them coming back more often. So then that amount of time that they're spending has a bigger chance of crowding out time for sleep, time for face-to-face social interaction, time for exercise, all these things that are much more beneficial for mental health. Then there's the problem that you can't reset the algorithm. So on an app like TikTok, where everything is basically the For You page, if a teen starts watching negative content, they just keep getting more and more and more negative content.
Jesus. When you put it like that, you have to delete your account, create an entirely new account, and then stop watching anything that resembles what you were previously watching. And that is not going to happen. That's bracing and kind of alarming. What about the social media downsides that we hear people talk about a lot that have to do with bullying or, comparison between you and the hottest person in your school, fear of missing out, I'm not the one who's currently on a vacation in Fiji with my wealthy parents, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's often going to be Instagram. And Meta, back when it was Facebook, found that themselves in their own internal research that was leaked a few years ago, found that Instagram led to body image issues and social comparison and the academic literature shows the same, that what happens with Instagram, I'm thinking too of the internal research from Meta and this page they showed, which they literally called a grief spiral, about how it starts. Say a teen girl, is looking at all the perfect bodies on Instagram, starts to compare herself, feels wanting. Then it becomes, okay, what do I do about that? Start searching for thinspiration content, which is a thing. Even pro-anorexia, very common on Instagram, sites that will teach teen girls how to lose extreme amounts of weight. And then it can, in some cases, end up in that spiral of just getting worse and worse and worse.
Do you know anything about distractibility and deep work and focus over the course of generations? Many of us have an anecdotal experience inside our own heads of finding it harder to read a long novel, or and so just coming back to TikTok and like Instagram Reels and so on, this quick, jumpy, dopaminergic kind of like flicker of attention grabbing. Do we know if that actually has a different impact on the way that we can perform deep work and consume deep material across generations?
I mean, we do know that young adults, for example, tend to spend only a few seconds on each thing on their phone. So a couple studies have looked at this, and they switch tasks like really, really, really quickly. And we also know that reading for pleasure has just plummeted among teens. So whether you're asking about books or asking about magazine articles or newspaper articles, or just online news articles, it's all of it has gone down. Books, it's the most stark. The percentage who say they read 0 books for pleasure used to be almost nothing, and now it's like 40% among 18-year-olds. So we definitely see that. Whether that's because they're spending a lot of that time on TikTok, or if it's because they can't concentrate, I suspect it's some of both.
Right. And do we know whether or not stretching all the way back to like the Greatest Generation or the Silent Generation, do we have any data about the ability to produce deep work or to focus pre-social media? Like, does it wax and wane? Does it fluctuate, or have we been pretty stable? Do we know?
Not that I know of. Now, I'd be happy to be wrong about this. So if you or any of your listeners find a study that had looked at attention span, across several generations, say at the same age, I haven't seen that. I'm not aware of that. But I hope it's out there.
Yeah, because I mean, you can imagine that as technology improves in every era, that old people feel like young people are distractible and task switching way too fast. I mean, I probably task switched faster than my parents did, and they probably task switched faster than their parents did. Right, as the world speeds up, and I'm certainly more capable and adept at tap dancing and spinning a lot of plates at once and showing up at the airport too late for my parents' comfort and all that sort of stuff.
That's partially age.
Right, it might be. Oh, I'm not sure. I think when they were my age, they were showing up 3 hours before the plane left. But I don't know. By the way, you're reminding me, I just noticed that there's a trend on TikTok at the moment which valorizes what young people are calling raw dogging on airplanes, which is not a sexual act. It's the idea that when you get on a plane, you don't bring your phone and you don't bring any electronics and you don't watch the seatback TV. You just might put on you might just put on the map, the in-flight map, and you just look out the window for the whole flight. And this is a novel thing. Of course, this is the way that we flew in our generation.
Exactly.
I mean, in the 90s, I would go and visit my grandparents in New Zealand, and there was no seatback television.
Better bring a book.
Yeah, bring a book or do some coloring in. But this is this weird thing that young people are doing, which is they're the first people in the universe who've ever discovered the possibility of being on a plane without spending the whole time surfing Instagram Reels and WhatsApping with your friends.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It's crazy.
Hilarious.
What about communal experiences and shared experiences? Because this is another thing while we're on the subject of TikTok and Instagram Reels and algorithms. When I was a boy, you could come to school and everyone would have watched Seinfeld, or they might have watched Letterman. And there were common cultural touchstones, right? We all felt like we were kind of consuming the same stuff. And now not only do we have lots and lots of things that we can watch on streamers, but the things that we can watch on algorithmically devised platforms like Instagram and TikTok, we're not even sharing from the same menu of items because there's only one version of our feed in the world, and there are billions of different versions of that. Do we have any idea what that's doing or what the implications of that are?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot in writing Generations because as a Gen Xer, I realized we were the last generation to have a really unified pop culture experience. And I think that's something that really brings Gen Xers together that Gen Z and Polars don't really have. I mean, there's a few things that have become a phenomenon that they talk about that most of them have seen. But they do have a common culture of certain memes that they talk about, but it's not the same as everybody watching a show and then the next day talking about it around the water cooler the way it was common in the 80s and 90s.
This is even bleeding into politics now in the sense that I was thinking about the way that politicians will speak to their base, and it'll sound like you don't even I remember the first debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and Trump was just saying things that I'd never heard. I didn't know what he was talking about, and then there would be explanatory thing. Oh, okay, so QAnon thinks this, and like there's, but like so many people are familiar with these touchstones that he's talking about. And I was living in the States at the time, so it wasn't because I was a foreigner. There are just these sub-communities of millions and millions of people who all have a common cultural experience that not only do I not share, I'm not even aware of them having.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why we have such big generation gaps now, is because our communication platforms are completely different based on age and generation. For Gen Z, it's TikTok. And very, very few boomers are on TikTok.
Yeah, right. What are they on? Facebook?
They're on Facebook. And so young people abandoned Facebook when grandma was on Facebook.
Yeah. That's right. It's all photos of grandchildren on holidays at the moment. Getting back to the trajectory of kind of justice and, the one thing that I'm very mindful of not doing is being the old guy on the porch waving his fist at young people, going like kids these days are broken or stupid. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't ways in which kids these days are broken and stupid and deserve to be called out for it. And so I'm trying to, separate which is the one from which is the other. And at the beginning of this conversation, you said that there's a legacy that Gen Z is building upon of, I suppose, justice. I mean, maybe this is the idea that the arc of, justice is long, or, whatever Obama's line was. It bends towards justice, right? The arc of history. One of the things that I hear people of my generation and older worry about in new social justice movements is the sense that actually social justice is being derailed from a sense of the sanctity of the individual and individual empowerment, and is becoming what Coleman Hughes would call sort of neo-racist. That, I alluded to this before, that there's an identitarianism, there's a groupthink, there's a fragility, there's a valorization of victimhood that is actually less like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Mandela, and sort of in a way more like an inversion of historical tribalisms that we might have previously associated with the white supremacist movements or something like that. Mm-hmm. Is it fair for us to worry about that? Do you regard that as being a blip on the Gen Z radar? Like, how do you interpret what's going on?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mystery, honestly. But, I think it's kind of the illogical outcome of some of the focus.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.